These houses are weird. From slightly odd shapes to complete redesigns of how people live, each represents a new concept of living and is a product of its time, something relevant even today. Europe, and with it the Netherlands, were in a dire state after World War II. Many cities were destroyed and there was an immense need for housing. The immediate solution for this was to just build cheaply, mainly in the form of high-rise flats. This escalated to the point where in the year 1967, up to 3/4 of newly built homes were gallery apartments. Although this worked initially, over time the repetitive nature of these buildings made people resent them, a sentiment that is known as apartment neurosis. The once considered ideal of a house with a garden was now unattainable in bigger cities. This led to a mass migration out of cities, with Rotterdam, for example, losing over 100,000 residents in just a span of 10 years. To combat this movement, the newly appointed minister of VRO, Wim Schut, came up with the idea of the experimental housing program in 1968, saying, "People don't know what they are missing." The goal of this program was to find innovations in housing design and improve the quality of living considerably over the monotony and uniformity of housing in the reconstruction period. So, how did the program work? Wim Schut was part of the anti-revolutionary party in the Netherlands. On April 5th, 1967, Schut was appointed as Minister for Housing and Regional Planning and founded the Experimental Housing Foundation a year later. This was realized with money from the Bouwfonds Nederlandse Gemeenten, which was owned by all Dutch municipalities and received additional funds from the Dutch government. The foundation didn't want to initiate projects itself, but rather motivate the private sector to experiment through grants and subsidies. There was an advisory committee made up of diverse groups of professionals, such as architects, urban planners, building engineers, contractors and investors, and also featured consumers. Municipalities and private architects alike could pitch their project to the committee, with them judging the experimental nature, price and feasibility. The committee then advised Wim Schut on whether or not to award the predicate, with him having the final say on the final approval of a project. Once approved, the foundation then used the money from the building fund to grant the subsidies to the private architects and municipalities directly and make the projects possible. Although the initial projects weren't particularly experimental, over time many interesting ideas came to fruition. The most famous example to come out of this project were the cube houses in Rotterdam. Although what you are seeing here is actually an earlier version, built in 1972 to 1977 by the same architect, Piet Bloem, in a small city called Helmond. He called these houses tree houses, inspired by the concept of a forest, with the cubes being an urban roof to a layered city, the ground level having public spaces that are easy to walk through, and dense housing above with holes in the structure to let light through to street level. The experimental nature of this project is pretty obvious, and the committee approved of the idea, but because of intense backlash from local architects and even national press, the plans were scaled back immensely from 188 to just 18 houses, with the fears that there was not enough interest in the homes. Then in 1977, the municipality of Rotterdam showed interest in the project, and a larger scale 37-house project was realized over 7 years around the harbor region. It is now world famous. Another realized project is called Zonnetrap in Rotterdam. Finished in 1978, the project was basically a small, self-contained city primarily built for seniors. The building is composed of 3 connected blocks of 5, 7 and 10 stories respectively. The residential homes are stacked on top of each other and offset so that everyone could have a spacious balcony with unobstructed views. There was a shared communal space with facilities like stores, offices and sports schools, making it easy for the residents to access them. by opening them up to non-residents as well, the plan was for the elderly people living there to interact with more people and prevent them from becoming lonely. The reaction to this project was highly positive, and the apartments are still in high demand today. The goal of this project was to create a car-free neighborhood with large yards. Whereas other neighborhoods at the time normally had streets 27 meters in width, this one reduced them to only 6 to 10 meters. The average backyard size was increased from 27 to 50 meters in diameter, which opened the possibilities to not only private gardens, but also communal gardens, parks and walkways that the living areas were oriented towards. Cars would be parked in garages and parking boxes at the beginning of streets, so that the rest of the neighborhood could stay completely car-free. It also incorporated many different types of housing, different size houses and apartment buildings, with the goal to create the most diverse group of residents possible. The project was deemed experimental because of its focus on community and living quality, in a time where car-centric infrastructure was dominating urban planning. The neighborhood still looks largely similar today and is enjoyed by its residents. Although these examples were very positive, the program also had many problems. Primarily that some projects were just different to be different, with no actual evaluation of the needs of the residents. And even though it was quite heavily subsidized, the experimental nature of the housing made it hard to build and resulted in comparatively high rents. This led to primarily young people with high levels of education living in the dwellings. So the houses themselves weren't really a solution to the initial problem of the low living quality for the average person. There were also inconsistencies in how projects were approved and considerable bias, with in-person explanations to the committee having higher chances of being approved. Even though the results of the housing projects were supposed to be analyzed, this step was often skipped, and so it was difficult to gauge the actual effectiveness of the housing. In the end, although by no means perfect, the project brought forward interesting ideas and created successful projects, with at least 12 of those projects being literally repeated without subsidy later on, and none of the realized projects have been demolished to this day. In today's world, with the housing markets being the way they are all over the world, programs like this might be a solution for the problem of scarce and low quality housing. Although many of the things learned and built might not be direct solutions, just the notion of experimenting and trying new things is important, daring to be different.